Okay, so the topic of this really brief presentation is on sleep debt. Now, this is probably, I would say, one of the most important concepts about sleep, and probably the most widely misunderstood concepts of sleep. So how many of you have ever heard people say, if you don't get enough sleep, you can't ever make it up. You can't make up lost sleep. Just get back to your normal sleeping routine. Actually, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, not only can you make up for lost sleep, but if you don't make up for lost sleep, you're more likely to experience feelings of depression, anxiety, stress, irritability. Obviously, you're more likely to experience daytime sleepiness and lower energy during the day. You're more likely to experience an impairment in your focus and concentration, impairment in hand-eye coordination and reaction time, as well as impairment in your judgment. Now, there are also long-term consequences of not making up sleep that you miss. So continuing to build up more and more sleep deprivation over time, when you're not getting enough sleep on a regular basis, is associated with increased risk of heart disease, heart arrhythmias, heart attack, high blood pressure, weight gain, diabetes, and stroke. So you definitely can make up sleep, and if you want to be as mentally and physically healthy as possible and be as happy and productive as possible throughout the days, you definitely need to make up sleep. Now, this brings us to this concept of what is sleep debt. So what is sleep debt? So the definition of sleep debt is just simply the accumulated deficit of sleep that occurs when someone doesn't meet their daily sleep requirement. Now, what a given individual's sleep requirement is it varies by the individual. The vast majority of adult humans need somewhere between 7 hours and 9 hours of sleep. Now, that could be 7 hours, it could be 7.5, 8, 8.5, 9. Some people need more than 9, some people need less than 7, but the number of people that need more or less than that window between 7 and 9 hours is extremely small. Very, very small percentage of the population. So your sleep debt is simply the amount of sleep that you've missed. So when you don't, let's say you need 8 hours and you only get 7, you have an hour of sleep debt. Okay, so here's some things about sleep debt that you should know. So the first, probably one of the most important things about sleep debt you should know is that sleep debt is cumulative. So in other words, every night that you don't get enough sleep, that adds to your sleep debt. So it's essentially a running tally of how much sleep you've missed versus how much sleep you need. So let's just say, for example, your personal need for sleep is 8 hours. So if you need 8 hours of sleep and you only get 6 hours one night, you now have a sleep debt of 2 hours. Now, let's say you actually only get that 6 hours 2 more nights in a row. So a total of 3 nights in a row, you only get 6 hours. Now your sleep debt is up to 6 hours. Okay, so let me give you another example just to illustrate something. Let's say again your sleep need is 6 hours. And let's say during the work week, starting Monday through Friday one week, these are the hours you sleep. So Monday you only get 6 hours. Tuesday you get your 8 hours. Wednesday you're back to 6 hours. Thursday you get your full 8 hours. Friday you get only 6 hours. At the end of that work week, you still have 6 hours of sleep debt. even though a couple of days in between you got your full 8 hours. You have to make up sleep. You accumulate sleep debt. So what happened on the Tuesday when you got 8 hours? Well, you didn't accumulate any more sleep debt, but you still carried the 2 hours of sleep debt from Monday. So when Wednesday came around and you got 6 hours again, you accumulated more sleep debt. Thursday, you got your full 8 hours, so you didn't add to your debt. Friday, you added 2 more hours to your debt. So the nights that you sleep 8, you don't accumulate more debt, but you also don't pay back any debt. And that sleep debt is cumulative, and the reason this is such an important concept is the more sleep debt that you have, the more of the negative consequences that I mentioned earlier you'll experience, and the more intensely you'll experience it. So that brings us to the next thing you should know about sleep debt. Okay, so the next thing you should know is how much sleep debt you have. Your amount of sleep debt is directly correlated with the degree, one, of daytime sleepiness. It's correlated with your degree of impairment in cognitive functioning, and it's also correlated with the intensity and degree of the negative mood effects that we mentioned earlier. So as you get more and more sleep debt, the sleepiness during the day gets worse and worse. The amount of impairment in your cognitive functioning, your ability to focus your attention and ability to your judgment and your hand-eye coordination and all of those things, it becomes worse. And of course, if your sleep debt gets too bad, you'll find yourself falling asleep during the day, especially during times, where it's quiet and there's not a lot of stimulation. So like when you're trying to read or maybe sit in a meeting, if you have enough sleep debt, you're actually going to find yourself falling asleep when you don't mean to. Now, just to kind of highlight this, there was a very interesting study done in late 90s. This was published in the journal Nature, which is basically one of the top journals for any type of science. And it was a study of sleep deprivation. So in study 1, they had a group of people that they kept up for 24 hours. So they had them all get up at a certain time. And every 30 minutes throughout the entire 24 hours, they gave them a computerized measure of hand-eye coordination. And what they were looking at in study 1 was how much decrease in performance did they see on this hand-eye coordination measure as a function of how long they had been awake. They found a whopping correlation of 0.94 between how much time the person had been awake and their decreases in performance on this hand-eye coordination test. That's a huge correlation. Now, this is where it gets particularly interesting. In study 2, they actually used the same subjects as study 1 because they wanted to make sure everybody, these two studies were equalized on factors like just general cognitive performance. Now, there's the same subjects as study 1, but they gave them plenty of time for them to have completely caught back up on their sleep, so they're fresh again. Now, in the study 2, what they did was they had them consume 10 to 15 grams of alcohol every 30 minutes, and every 30 minutes they also took their did a breathalyzer to measure their blood alcohol concentration. They gave them 10 to 15 grams of alcohol at 30-minute intervals until their average blood alcohol concentration was up to 0.1%, which is the legal limit in most states for driving under the influence of alcohol. Now, they were also every 30 minutes given the same test of hand-eye coordination that they did in study 1. Now, they also, obviously, as you would expect, found a very strong correlation between blood alcohol level, blood alcohol concentration, and decrease in performance on this test. Now, what was fascinating was they looked at the degree of impairment compared to the degrees of impairment in the sleep deprivation study. And essentially, the impairment in performance that they saw at 0.1% blood alcohol, so with legally intoxicated, was equal to the impairment in performance after being awake for 24 hours, which is equivalent to about 8 hours of sleep debt. So this really kind of hits it home, I think. And basically, if you have 8 hours of sleep debt or you stay awake for 24 hours straight, you can expect that your impairment in performance and things like hand-eye coordination and reaction time and things like that are going to be about the same as if you were legally intoxicated. So take-home message here is relatively moderate levels of fatigue can actually impair your performance to an extent that's equal to or greater than the legal limit for alcohol intoxication. Okay, so now let's talk about how to actually measure your sleep debt. So how can you get an idea of how much sleep debt you actually have? And sometimes people are surprised, that they have more than they realize. That can happen when you carry sleep debt, for long periods of time. You just start to feel like that's just sort of normal life. So it can be really useful, even if you think you don't have sleep debt or don't have much, it can be really useful to get an idea of an actual measurement of it. So there's a couple of different ways to measure it. The first method, it's a little bit less accurate, but it's the easiest to do. And you can basically estimate how much sleep debt you have based on how sleepy you feel on average throughout the day. So the degree of sleepiness you feel, or kind of the average amount of sleepiness you feel taken multiple times during the day, is directly correlated with how much sleep debt you have. And there's a great little tool that you can use that's been scientifically validated and has interpretation guidelines based on the research with it that you can use to really get a good quantification of your sleepiness. It's called the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. So if you just go, actually I have a link here in the slides, and if you go to at epworthsleepiness.scale.com, you can find the scale and take it, and it also has guidelines for how to interpret it. But essentially what the Epworth Sleepiness Scale does, I think it's about 10 items, and it asks you to estimate, it gives you 10 different situations, hypothetical situations, and asks you to estimate how likely are you, given how you feel right now, how likely are you to fall asleep, doze off, without trying to go to sleep. And there are things like, sitting quietly after lunch, being a passenger in a car for at least an hour, talking, having a conversation with someone, things like that. And you rate it on like a scale of 0 to 4, I think, something like that. And you basically add up your score, and there are guidelines for interpreting what that score means in terms of how sleep deprived you are and the severity of it. Now, the second method is the most accurate, and it's a little bit more complicated. It's called the multiple sleep latency test. So what sleep latency is basically how quickly you fall asleep when you're relaxing in a quiet, dark room. So, the idea here is the more sleep debt you have, the more quickly you will fall asleep. when you're trying to sleep and it's a quiet, dark room. Now, to do the test, you're supposed to measure your sleep latency over a series of 4 to 5 scheduled naps during the day, with a couple of hours in between. You don't want to do this at night because that'll skew the results, because we have a lot more what we call sleep pressure at night, and we produce melatonin because that's the time we're normally going to fall asleep. For the test, you want to do it several times during the day. For this to be accurate, you also need to be woken up as soon as you fall asleep, because if you fall asleep and then you nap for an hour, you're reducing sleep debt, so that's going to mess up the results. Now, often this is done in a sleep clinic lab where they hook you up to EEG monitoring, where they can verify exactly when you fall asleep, but you actually can do this at home. So how do you do the at-home version? Well, one way is you could have somebody watch you and try to figure out when you're asleep. You could do that if you want. It's not quite as accurate as this method I'm going to tell you, but essentially if they look for, changes in your facial expression where, your face looks more relaxed and your breathing changes, maybe you start snoring, they can time how long it takes. What I would recommend doing is what I call the spoon and plate method. So basically this is a way of waking yourself up as soon as you fall asleep. So you're going to get your room ready, get situated. You want to do this in the bed where you normally sleep, or a sofa if that's where you normally sleep. And obviously you need a clock, record. You're going to record, either start a timer or write down the time when you actually close your eyes and start trying to go to sleep. But here's what you do. You hold a spoon in one hand and just, slightly have that spoon hanging over the edge of the bed. Just hold it really lightly. And put a plate on the floor directly below the spoon. So essentially, when you drop the spoon, it'll hit the plate and make a big racket. So do that, start the timer or write down the time when you're ready to sleep. Hold the spoon overhanging the edge, in a position where you're comfortable. And when you fall asleep, when you hit stage 1 of sleep, you'll lose enough muscle tone where you'll actually drop the spoon. So that's basically, and then obviously you look at the clock or your timer and write down how long it took you to fall asleep. Now, if you're not asleep within 20 minutes, you can stop the test and your score is a 20. That's the max score. Now, how do you interpret the sleep test? Now, ideally you do this over 3, 4, 5 different times and take the average. But even if you just do this a couple times, it can be really useful. And the way you interpret the score is on the next slide. So how do you interpret the results? So if it took you between 15 and 20 minutes, you're doing really well. You have little to no sleep debt. Or there's a possibility you took the test during a time of what we call peak alerting in your circadian rhythm. But that's one of the reasons it's good to do it 3, 4, 5 times and take the average. But in general, if you took 15 to 20 minutes to fall asleep during the day, you have little to no sleep debt. Now, if you took between 10 to 15 minutes, you've got a little bit of sleep debt, but it's manageable. You could probably feel some improvements in how you feel during the day and your energy level and your focus and attention by sleeping off some of that sleep debt. But you have a manageable amount of sleep debt. If you fell asleep within 5 to 10 minutes, you've got a pretty significant amount of sleep debt. You're very likely to feel low energy during the dips in your circadian rhythm during the day, or when you're sitting quietly or doing something that doesn't have a lot of stimulation, like driving or just sitting and trying to read or in a meeting. You're very likely to feel a lot of low energy. and you're going to be experiencing some of those deficits in your reaction time and your thinking and processing of information. Now, if you fell asleep within 1 to 5 minutes, that's a serious sleep deprivation. And if you aren't really sure of why you have that much sleep debt, you know you've stayed up, only slept a couple of hours a few nights in a row, it could, if this score could quite possibly be due to a sleep disorder like sleep apnea or insomnia. And also people with a sleep disorder called narcolepsy actually score in this range. And with narcolepsy, they're actually repeatedly, throughout the day fighting off really serious daytime sleepiness and bouts of unexpected sleep where they just fall asleep without intending to. So that's a pretty good interpretation of the sleep latency test. There are definitely other things that are important about sleep, but that's pretty much one of the most important concepts is sleep debt and understanding how much sleep debt you have. And by the way, the only way to work off sleep debt is to sleep more. Sleeping and going to bed a little bit earlier for a period of time, sleeping in for a period of time. Naps can also help.